The alien hunt begins. The ground was wet and warm under their feet as the 6 apex predators stepped off their ship onto the blue and green world the locals called Earth. They were called the Krevlon, and across the galaxy they were feared by every species that valued life. The Krevlon were born to hunt. Their claws were like blades, their teeth like spears, and their vision could pierce through trees and mist and shadows. And yet here they were stalking a prey that looked so soft, so weak, so simple. The humans, the thrill of the chase had brought them here, and the promise of meat that fights back. The trees rustled with life, but no birds sang, no wind blew. It was as if the planet itself held its breath. One of the Krevlon clicked his jaws, a signal that told the others to fan out and search the perimeter. Their translator had warned them of human terrain, their strange biomes, their volatile climate, but none of it mattered. They had hunted venom bears across the acid lakes of Zarnar. They had tamed flame wolves on the lava moons of Kras. What could a few upright primates do to them? As they moved deeper into the forest, they started to notice something odd. No signs of animal life, no carcasses, no feces, no nesting, no sense other than the strange, thick human scent like smoke and soil and old blood. Their lead scout, whose name was Krovak, stopped by a tree that had long claw marks across it, but those marks were not Krevlon. They were deeper, wider, more precise, as if made not out of panic but out of intent, like a message, a warning. Krovak turned, but before he could signal the others, a sharp whistling sound flew through the air, and his chest exploded in red mist. He collapsed without a sound, his limbs twitching. A wooden spike had impaled him clean through the armor. The others screamed in their language of snarls and hisses, but even before they could process the ambush, a second body dropped, then a third. Both clean kills, one from above and one from the side. The forest came alive with movement, not wild animals, not machines, just shadows, fast and silent and terrifying. The 3 remaining Krevlon huddled back to back, their heat vision catching glimpses of figures moving like ghosts. One of them activated a distress beacon, but it gave no signal, just static and silence. Then the first human stepped forward. She was small by Krevlon standards, but her eyes were not. Her eyes were still like stone, but burned with a fire that none of them had seen before. She carried no blaster, no tech, just a sharpened spear made of bone and metal. She said nothing, just stared, then pointed behind them. The Krevlon turned slowly and gasped. Their ship was gone. Not damaged, not burning, just gone, vanished from the clearing as if it never existed. One of them howled in disbelief. The other dropped to his knees and began muttering in his own tongue about spirits and curses and death. The last tried to run, but his leg was caught in a crude loop trap that yanked him up and slammed him into a tree. The human woman nodded once, and others stepped out from the trees, a dozen, maybe more, some old, some young, even one child holding what looked like a slingshot with glass shards. They were not soldiers, not uniformed. They wore mismatched armor, scavenged gear. Some had bones strapped to their arms. Some had predator teeth woven into necklaces, and all of them were silent. They dragged the remaining Krevlon to a pit dug deep with care and lined with spikes. They did not speak, they simply did, and the message was clear. This was not the humans being hunted. This was them doing the hunting. Night fell, and the forest remained still. And at the center of the clearing, a fire burned bright and around it sat the humans, cooking meat over open flame. The smell was thick and strange and rich, and to the Krevlon horror, they saw what was roasting it was the leg of Krovak, skinned, cleaned, seasoned. The humans laughed and passed meat between them, like nothing was wrong, like this was dinner, like the apex predator was just another part of their menu. The female human looked over at the caged aliens and said one word in rough translation. Predator. The child beside her repeated the word with a smile and bit into the roasted meat without fear, without disgust, without blinking. The Krevlon were silent now, frozen in their cage, not just by the pain of loss or the horror of death, but by the realization that everything they believed about power, about food, about domination was wrong, horribly wrong. The humans were not prey. They were something else, something ancient, something that had survived, not by luck, but by will, by unity, by cruelty if needed. And as the stars glimmered above and the Fire snapped and popped, and the smell of cooked flesh danced in the night air. The last three Krevlon knew a truth that chilled their bones. No one would come to save them, because no one in the galaxy dared to come to Earth, not after what happened. Last time, and yet here they were, bones soon to be weapons, flesh soon to be meals, and memories soon to be nothing. Predators become prey. The cold did not bother them anymore, because fear had already taken their breath and turned it into ash. The three surviving Krevlon sat in the crude wooden cage made from sharpened branches bound with strips of something that smelled like cured flesh. Maybe predator skin, maybe something worse. They no longer looked around for escape. They no longer shouted into the night for rescue. They simply stared into the dancing firelight, watching humans devour what remained of their fallen with calm smiles and quiet murmurs like families at a peaceful meal. The woman who led them, she had no name. The Krevlon could understand, but the others called her Mara. She was not large or loud. She did not wear the most gear or carry the biggest weapons, yet the way she moved made even the other humans wait and listen. Her presence carved silence into the air around her. She stood now, sharpening a long blade made from fused bone and scavenged alloy taken from their own ship, perhaps, and her eyes were fixed not on the fire but on the forest, as if she knew something was coming, or maybe just waiting for it to arrive. Beside her, an old man with a missing arm handed her a strip of dried meat and said something low. Mara smiled and nodded, and then she walked slowly toward the cage. The Krevlon tried to stand, but their muscles ached from wounds and hunger and terror. She knelt before them and lifted the flap of their prison and tossed something inside. At first, they thought it was another trap, but it was food meat, heavily seasoned and slightly burnt. They hesitated, but one of them, a younger scout named Thren, reached forward and took it into his claws, sniffed, and then bit into it. The flavor burst through his tongue like lightning. It was rich, spiced, cooked with care. It was predator meat, but not Krevlon, something else, something large. Armored, he devoured it, quickly licking his claws while the others stared. Mara spoke one word, eat, and then walked away, without waiting for thanks or answer, as if she knew they would obey. And they did. By nightfall, the humans began another hunt. Some stayed behind to guard the prisoners, but most slipped into the trees with bows, spears, and sharpened blades. There were no maps, no digital readouts, just instinct, teamwork, and whispers. They moved like shadows and struck like storms, and the next morning they returned not empty-handed. They dragged two massive beasts, one with razor tusks, the other with scale armor across their backs, and laid them beside the fire pit. The children gathered to help skin and clean the meat. They did not scream or gag when blood splashed across their faces. They simply worked together, like it was normal, like it was survival. Thren watched all this, and a strange feeling grew in his chest. It was not fear, though fear lived there now like a parasite. It was something else. Respect, maybe confusion, maybe envy. These humans had no plasma rifles, no orbital strikes, no armored drones, yet they thrived here. Not just survived, they built with sticks, fought with stones, and still they danced around fires and laughed at death. How could this be? The apex predators were supposed to rule the stars, not fall to dirt walkers with fire and sticks. But the proof was there in the smoke, in the bones, in the silence of his fallen crew. One night, Thren saw something that shook him to the core. A small human child, no more than 7 cycles old, walked into the cage area with a giant bone slung over his shoulder. The bone was shaped into a spear, longer than he was tall, with sharpened edges carved by hand. He walked right up to the cage, looked into Thren's eyes, and said a word that the translator could barely catch. Dinner. Then he turned and walked away, dragging the weapon behind him, scratching lines into the dirt like ancient runes. Thren looked at the other 2 survivors and saw that they too had lost the will to resist. They were not just defeated, they were unraveled. They were prey. Now every movement they made was watched by 100 silent eyes. Every breath felt borrowed. The woman Mara returned one evening carrying something strange. It was a helmet, Krevlon design, twisted and broken with a single hole through the forehead. She held it out to Thren, and he took it slowly, recognizing it as his captain's, his mentor, his strongest ally. She whispered something too quiet for the translator to catch, then placed a hand on the cage and walked away, and Thren knew then that this was not just survival, this was art to them. The hunt was not about food or threat or gain, it was something older, something sacred, and it terrified him. The humans had turned their entire world into one massive trap, and they were the bait, the blade, and the feast all in one. Thren finally understood why the stars whispered about Earth in fear, why old maps labeled it as cursed, why even warlords spoke the name with hushed tones. They were not supposed to come here, and yet they did, for glory, for profit, for thrill. Now they sat broken, waiting to be cooked one piece at a time, and the fire never stopped burning. The truth about Earth in the far corners of the Krevlon Empire. There were stories passed from generation to generation about a cursed planet, a planet where shadows hunted the stars, and where the wind carried the screams of giants. Many believed those were myths, created to scare young warriors away from foolish pride. The stories spoke of a planet with no single ruler, no unified army, no spacefaring fleets, yet when explorers touched its soil, they never returned, or worse, they returned broken, silent, empty-eyed, and lost within themselves. That planet was Earth, and the Krevlon had been warned long ago never to enter its orbit, never to touch its ground, never to provoke the ones called human. But greed is louder than wisdom, and pride is louder than truth, and a black market syndicate known as the Red Fang had paid handsomely to erase Earth's danger markers from the interstellar maps. They wanted thrill, they wanted rare meat, rare trophies, rare adrenaline, so they hired Krevlon hunters who had never tasted failure to come down and make a show of the hunt. They erased the warnings, they bypassed the protocols, they fooled the young brutes with promises of glory, and now their mistake had a price that could not be measured in credits. Thrawn sat by the cage with his head resting against the cold bark of the bars, his mind drifting between fear and memory. He remembered the training halls of Crusher Prime, the way they taught him to kill without sound, the way they drilled into him that Krevlon were gods among beasts, and everything else was meat to be tested, measured, consumed. He remembered being told that humans were primitive animals with fire sticks and fragile minds, unworthy of war, only useful for sport. He believed that once. Now he knew better. Now he knew the truth. Mara walked past him again, never rushing, never afraid. She moved like someone who had nothing left to prove. Her eyes were steady, her skin painted with ash and old blood, her hair tied back with what looked like a cord made from the tendons of something large. She glanced down at Thren, and for a moment he thought he saw something in her eyes, not cruelty, not anger, something stranger, pity perhaps, or recognition. Then she moved on, leaving behind a silence heavier than any words. Later that night, as the sky turned violet with two moons glowing above one of the older humans, an elder with metal rods replacing half his spine came to sit beside the cage he carried. No weapons, only a small box that glowed faintly. He pressed it, and a projection lit the ground, a hologram of a human world, cities in flames, oceans boiling, skies filled with fire and screaming metal. The Krevlon flinched, but the old man said nothing. He just watched. Then the projection shifted, showing humans rising again, building again, fighting again, growing again, never stopping, never giving up, always becoming more dangerous, always learning, always evolving. Thren asked, "Why are you showing me this?" The old man looked at him and finally spoke in slow, careful words, "Because you are not the first, and you will not be the last. The galaxy forgets, but we remember your kind came here once before, not Krevlon, not your name, but others who thought as you do. They brought machines, they brought war, they brought fire, and they burned our skies, and they killed our people, and they laughed while they did it. So we learned, we remembered, we trained, we adapted, and we became something they could never predict, something they could never stop. We became the hunters of hunters, and now we wait. We do not reach out, we do not travel the stars, but when they come, when they step foot here, they meet what you met, and they do not leave. Thren closed his eyes and saw it all clearly now, the empty warnings, the lost patrols, the silent files marked classified, the reason why no one ever came back. The humans had not just survived their own extinction, They had mastered it, turned it into fuel, turned it into rage, turned it into a strategy. They were not strong because they avoided pain. They were strong because they welcomed it, made it a blade, and now that blade was at his throat and he had no armor left to wear one. Of the Krevlon beside him, a bruiser named Varric tried to speak to the others, tried to remember escape tactics or hunting formations, but his voice was thin, his mind cracked. The fear had taken root too deep, and it bloomed like rot. The third alien, a silent scout named Renox, stared at the fire and whispered something about ghosts, something about ancestors warning him in dreams. The fire popped and hissed and shadows danced across their faces, and every sound in the forest was followed by silence, as if the planet itself was watching them, waiting to see if they would break. The next day Mara brought them water, not poisoned, not drugged, just cold fresh water in wooden bowls, and she placed them inside the cage without a word. Thren drank slowly, then said to her, "You knew we were coming. You planned all of this." Mara looked at him, her voice flat. "We always planned for guests." The wind picked up and carried the smell of cooked meat again, and Thren wondered how many other species had come to Earth before them, how many bones were buried beneath this forest, how many stories had ended with fire and silence, and how many more would come, still believing that humans were weak, only to find themselves in cages licking predator blood from resistance. From within, the sky above the forest turned gray as the sun vanished behind thick clouds, casting a heavy mood across the human camp. Smoke rose slowly from the fire pit where fresh meat was roasting, and the air smelled of wood, ash, and cooked flesh. The three remaining Krevlon sat inside the cage, their eyes dull, their muscles sore, their thoughts drowned in fear and silence. But inside one of them something began to shift. Thren, the youngest, the most observant, he had watched every movement, every word, every ritual of these humans, and he had started to see a pattern, something deeper than strength or instinct, something that felt like purpose. He watched a woman with a limp chase down a wild beast, using only her voice and a rope. He saw a child no older than 10 seasons disarm a snare and reset it with skill beyond his years. He saw old men blind in one eye giving orders that everyone obeyed without question, not because of rank, but because of trust. And he saw Mara always watching, always knowing exactly when to speak and when to vanish into the forest. Like wind into leaves, Thren began to wonder if this was what power truly looked like, not the roar of dominance, not the crush of fear, but the quiet strength of unity. Every human had scars, but none of them hid their pain. They wore it like armor, not decoration. They celebrated life, but not in ignorance. They laughed at the fire but kept their blades close and their senses sharp. They treated their enemies with cold respect and their dead with strange reverence. Even their food was honored, not wasted, not overindulged, but shared slowly with gratitude. Thren looked at Varric, whose strength had turned to trembling, and at Renox, whose silence had become haunted whispers, and he realized that he was the last one, still thinking, still questioning, still resisting the fall of their pride. He began to scrape his claws against the cage floor, carving small lines, not to escape, but to count, to remember, to focus his mind, and each line became a thought, a lesson, a question he had never dared to ask before. Why do they not kill us if we are food then? Why let us live if we are enemies? Then why feed us if we are beasts? Then why do they look at us like they see something else? Thren needed answers, not just for survival but for truth. And one evening when the others were away, when the fire was low and the stars began to show, he saw Mara walking alone near the edge of the trees, and he called out to her using the human word, "Please." She stopped but did not turn her back to him. She waited, and he spoke again, his voice shaking, not from fear, but from something deeper. "I do not understand you, your people, this place. Why are we alive? Why are you not afraid of us? Why do you not kill us? If you see us as threat." She turned then and walked slowly to the cage, her eyes lit by the dim glow of fire and starlight. She looked at him for a long time, and then spoke, not in anger, not in pride, but with quiet fire in her voice. "You are not a threat, not anymore." Thren felt those words cut deeper than any blade, but still he pushed. "Why do you let Ewas breathed, her gaze did not soften. We have seen worse and lived. We have fought gods and bled. We have lost everything and built it back with our hands. You are not our first, you will not be our last. We do not kill unless we must, but we do not forget. Then she reached into her pouch and threw something at his feet. It was a small stone tablet, etched with symbols not Krevlon, not human, something older. When he touched it, his translator flickered and struggled and finally whispered one word: survive. She left him with that and walked away, disappearing into the dark without another word. And Thren held the stone close, not because it was powerful, but because it was real, because it meant something he could not explain. The next morning, something even stranger happened as the sun rose and the mist rolled through the trees. Two humans approached the cage and unlocked it without chains, without weapons. They pointed to Thren and gestured for him to follow, not the others, only him. He stepped out slowly, expecting a trap, expecting death, expecting judgment. But none came. Instead, they led him to the edge of the forest, where a small clearing opened to reveal a long wooden structure half hidden by leaves. It was not a prison, not a ship, not a temple. It was something else, and inside it he saw something that shattered the last wall of his belief. Dozens of weapons, dozens of bones, dozens of symbols from races across. The stars hung like trophies, like warnings, like stories, and in the center was a mural painted in blood and ash, a human standing over the corpse of a giant beast. Not in triumph, but in sorrow. Mara stood beside it and spoke again. This time softer. We fight because we must, we win, but we mourn every death, even yours, even the ones who came to end us. Thren felt his legs give out as he dropped to his knees, not in pain, not in shame, but in understanding. He saw now that resistance did not mean fighting. Sometimes it meant seeing what was real and choosing to change before the fire burned you into dust. Part 5. Dinner with the Deadly. The wind whispered across the clearing as the last light of the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows that danced around the human camp. The fire had already been lit, and the scent of cooking meat filled the air, rich, smoky, and laced with spices unfamiliar to Thren, who now sat not behind the cage, but beside it, a silent guest under human watch. He had not spoken much since Mara had led him to the hall of bones and truths. His thoughts were full of questions that had no answers, or perhaps the answers had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, carved into the faces of those who survived not by fear, but by choice. The other two, Krevlon, still remained in the cage, untouched, unspoken, to staring blankly at nothing, as if their minds had already departed and only their bodies remained. But Thren was changing, not just in his thoughts, but in how he saw everything around him. He no longer watched humans with hatred or suspicion. He watched them like one watches fire, with awe and fear, and the realization that to touch it would either warm your soul or burn you into nothing. A group of humans were gathered around the pit, preparing the evening meal. Two large beasts lay beside the flames, their bodies skinned and cleaned, their flesh sectioned with precision. Every part had a purpose, nothing wasted, nothing ignored. Even the bones were being carved into tools, into decorations, into weapons. It was not savagery, it was something else, something older, deeper, a ritual of respect and control. Then the humans brought forward something wrapped in thick leaves and cloth, and when they unwrapped it, Thren felt his chest tighten with something sharp and strange. It was the body of Varric, the strongest of their hunting squad, laid bare with care, his armor removed, his claws cleaned, his eyes closed, as if in sleep and not death. Mara stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, her expression unreadable, her voice calm. This is your warrior, we honor him now. They did not ask Thren for permission, they did not seek forgiveness or apology. They simply moved with rhythm and purpose, lifting the body and placing it near the fire, not to burn, but to prepare. And Thren felt no anger, no outrage, only the cold reality that in this place everything had meaning, even death. Humans began to roast the meat, slowly turning it over the flames, brushing it with herbs and oils harvested from the forest. Their movements were slow and deliberate, not wasteful, not rushed. Children watched from a distance, some holding small tools, learning how the meat changed color, how the scent shifted, how patience was the sharpest blade when the meal was ready. They did something unexpected. They prepared a plate and brought it to Thren, placing it in front of him with silence, and then stepping back as if to say, "This is yours." Not as a prisoner, not as a predator, not even as a guest, but as one who sees, one who listens, one who might become something else. He stared at the food, his mind torn between instinct and understanding. The meat was tender, the skin crisp, the smell like a challenge and a comfort. All at once he picked it up slowly and took a bite, and the taste hit him like a storm, rich, layered, powerful, not because of the spices or the flame, but because of what it meant. This was not just food. This was victory turned into memory. This was death transformed into survival. The humans around him ate without loudness, without boasting. They passed the meat with quiet words and careful eyes, and every piece was honored, every bite remembered, not with sadness, but with strength and unity. They ate because they lived, and they lived because they had learned how to face death, not avoid it. Mara sat across from him, her eyes steady, her hands working on carving something into a flat piece of wood, a pattern, a story. Maybe she looked up and spoke. "You see now, do you not?" Thren nodded slowly, unable to find words that matched the weight in his chest. She continued, "We do not hunt for power, we do not kill for pride, but when the stars send monsters to our home, we do not run and we do not break. We take what comes and we turn it into something that feeds our people, something that reminds us who we are." Thren finished the last bite and placed the bone carefully beside him, not on the ground, not tossed aside, but set with intention like the others had done. He looked at Mara and asked, "What do you want from me?" She replied, "Nothing, only that you remember." The night stretched on, and the stars returned above them, unbothered by the fire and the feast, and the quiet truths exchanged between beings who once came to destroy, and those who chose to rebuild instead of surrender. Thren sat in the silence, surrounded by humans who had once been prey and now shared meat made from their nightmares, and he knew something final had changed in him, not just his loyalty, not just his belief, but his identity. He was no longer Krevlon in the way his people defined it. He was something else now, something between beast and witness, between enemy and student. And as the flames crackled and the bones piled beside the fire, Thren understood that this was not a dinner. It was a lesson, a vow, a warning to the galaxy that humans did not beg, humans did not vanish. Humans invited death to the table and made it part of the meal, the surrender protocol. The cold wind swept across the forest with a new kind of stillness. The fires from the night before had dimmed into soft orange embers, and the bones from the feast were now buried deep beneath the earth, placed with care and quiet rituals. The humans moved with purpose as always. Not in panic, not in chaos, but in unity. They sharpened weapons, checked traps, cleaned gear, and prepared for what they knew would come, because somewhere out in orbit, the signal had been sent, and the Krevlon Empire had surely received the distress call. Only Thren understood that it would make no difference. The message they sent was not a plea for help, it was a scream of defeat disguised as protocol. The humans had intercepted it, rerouted it, then replied in their own way, a single word sent across the void, acknowledged. Now the forest stood ready, and every hunter, every child, every elder waited not for rescue, but for the moment they would be tested again. Thren stood among them, no longer chained, no longer watched. He had been given freedom, not because they trusted him fully, but because they had no fear left for his kind to feed on. He wore simple furs wrapped around his body, stitched by the hands of those who had once been his prey. He carried no weapon, only a message, and he knew his purpose. Above the clouds, the Krevlon retrieval ship hovered silent and invisible. Its crew of war veterans watched the surface through thermal scans and heartbeat sensors, and what they saw made no sense. Dozens of humans scattered in perfect formations, no panic, no retreat, no sign of weakness, and at the center of the heat map was Thren, clearly marked, clearly moving toward the only open field. They sent a message: prepare for extraction. All survivors report immediately. And when Thren Responded he used human symbols carved into a large flat stone laid in the grass. Where the retrieval drone could scan it, the symbols said, "I am the last and I choose peace." Confusion erupted aboard the ship. Commanders shouted over one another, demanding explanations, accusing error, but the truth burned across their screens. Thren had surrendered not to them, but to Earth, and in doing so he had declared that the hunt was over and that the predators had lost. Mara stood behind him, silent, her arms crossed. Her face calm, not smiling, not gloating, just waiting, as if the outcome was already known. The sky above rumbled as a drop pod descended, breaking through the clouds with a trail of flame and metal. It landed hard, spraying soil and smoke in every direction, but no human flinched. They held their ground, watching with the stillness of statues. The pod opened, and 3 armored Krevlons stepped out, weapons drawn, eyes scanning, ready for attack, but none came, only Thren walking forward, his hands raised, not in surrender, but in understanding. He spoke in his own tongue, telling them what had happened, what he had seen, what he had become, and they looked at him with disbelief and disgust, calling him broken, weak, curse, but he stood tall and repeated his truth. The humans are not prey, they are not beasts, they are not simple, they are the test we all fail. Commander ordered Thren to return to the ship to be judged, to be stripped of rank and memory. But Thren refused. He turned and walked back toward the humans, who did not move, who did not blink, and the message became clear. Earth was not a place to conquer. Earth was a place to survive, if allowed, if invited, if worthy. Mara stepped forward and spoke to the Krevlon commander through a small translator device, her voice calm. "Your kind came here, thinking you could hunt us. You thought we were scattered, easy, desperate. But you forgot the oldest truth. The hunted learn faster than the hunter. And when the hunter bleeds, the hunted becomes something else." The commander tried to speak, but his voice cracked, and his armor felt heavier than ever before. Thren looked at him one last time and said, "You sent us to die, and now I will live, not as Krevlon, not as predator, but as something new." The Krevlon soldiers returned to their ship without firing a shot, and the pod lifted into the sky, swallowed by clouds and silence. No declaration of war, no promise of revenge, only the echo of a failed conquest and a planet that had changed one of their own forever. That night the humans built a new fire, not for cooking, not for celebration, but for remembrance. They sang songs in languages Thren could not yet understand, but the feelings were clear. They remembered every life, every loss, every victory, and Thren sat among, not apart, not above, not below, but equal. He helped carry wood, helped stir the fire, helped carve new traps for the edge of the forest, and though many still watched him with careful eyes, no one pushed him away. No one mocked his silence, no one feared his claws, because he had laid them down, not to please them, but because he no longer needed them. Forest felt different, now, not safer, not softer, but familiar. The air carried his breath without judgment, and the soil held his steps, like it had always known he would return, not as a conqueror, but as a student, and perhaps someday as family. Mara sat beside him, her hands working on a new blade carved from the tooth of a beast they had slain together. And she looked at him not with kindness or pity, but with respect, the kind that could only be earned through fire, through blood, through truth. The surrender protocol had been activated, but it was not the Krevlon who received it, it was the galaxy. And it came not in code, not in threats, but in the story of a warrior who sat at the fire of his. What the galaxy learns, the stars burned cold above the black stretch of space as the Krevlon warship drifted through the void, silent, and scarred, its metal skin marked by the echoes of failure. The crew had not spoken since the retrieval from Earth. Their orders were to return Thren to high command for memory purge and re-education, but Thren had stayed behind, and they had left without him because they had seen what he saw, and none of them dared challenge it openly. Not now, not after watching the so-called primitives walk among death like old friends, not after witnessing what it meant to become the hunted. The Krevlon High Council reviewed the footage with narrowed eyes and clenched claws, watching as humans cooked predator meat with smiles, as children carved bone into tools, as warriors moved without fear. And as Thren spoke of a fire that no wind could put out, they did not understand how this had happened, how a forgotten backwater planet had turned legends into warnings and glory into shame. But one word began to rise in their discussions, a word that had never before belonged to human survival on Earth. The wind had changed, and the forest whispered a new song. Thren now lived among the humans, not as a guest, not as a prisoner, but as one of them. He rose with the hunters, helped mend the nets, cleaned the blades, sat with the children, and told stories of stars in silence. Stories of how his people once ruled with terror, and how terror had turned on them. He did not pretend to be something. He did not beg for trust or forgiveness. He simply remained, and the humans watched, and slowly they began to nod in silent respect. Mara continued to lead with quiet strength, her presence like the forest itself, full of patience and danger, her hands never idle, her mind always listening. She had seen Thren become something no Krevlon had ever dared to be honest. And she knew that meant more than any oath or treaty. Because when an enemy learns your ways and chooses your path, he no longer carries the flag of conquest. He carries the mark of truth. Word of the failed hunt spread beyond Krevlon space, across trading routes and smuggler rings, into Senate halls and private war rooms, and every time the name Earth was spoken, silence followed. No one laughed at humans. Now no one planned missions to conquer. No one dared recruit bounty seekers to track their lands, because all those who returned carried the same warning: do not follow the fire. In the heart of the Galactic Senate, a heated debate began. Some demanded that Earth be quarantined forever, marked as a sovereign death world, untouchable by law or greed. Others whispered of alliances, of trying to make peace before the humans decided they had learned enough and were ready to leave the forest, ready to climb into the stars and bring their fire with them. But Earth made no message. Earth sent no reply. Earth remained what it had always been, a place that tested those who entered, a place that did not forgive arrogance, a place that offered no second chances, but always watched for those who could learn. Thren now slept under the trees, his armor long gone, his name spoken by human children. As a tale of change, they carved his story into wood and stone, not as a savior, not as a hero, but as proof that even predators can become protectors if they choose to see. He taught them how to read alien code, how to speak in tongues used by distant races, how to understand the machines that still lay buried in the wrecks scattered across the forest. But he never spoke of war again, only of warning, only of wisdom. And when asked if his people would return, he answered with honesty, I do not know. But if they do this time, they will come with questions, not weapons. Mara stood beside him one evening, watching the stars blink like old eyes. She asked, what would you do if they forced you to return? And he looked at her not with fear, but with peace, and said, I would bring them back here, so they too could eat what I ate, see what I saw, and lose what I lost. She nodded and said, then you are one of us. And so the fire continued to burn in the heart of the wild, not just for warmth or food, but as a beacon to those who wandered too far, believing they could own what was never meant to be claimed. Earth had never left the stars. It had simply waited for the stars to remember, and now they had, and the story that began with blood and hunger ended with one truth carved into every tree and spoken by every voice that survived. Humans do not fear the dark, they were born in it. They do not run from death, they walk beside it. They do not beg for peace, they build it with fire. And if you come for them, bring more than weapons. Bring humility, bring respect, bring your last breath. Because humans do not just survive, they change the hunter. They eat the apex, and they remember everything. The last ember. The forest stood still beneath the quiet moon, its leaves trembling gently, as if remembering all that had passed. Thren walked alone through the dark trail, his feet light on the earth, his breath steady, his eyes wide open. He was no longer the same creature who had landed from the stars, with pride in his veins and blood on his tongue. He was something older, something simpler, something true. Each step he took was guided by the voices of those who came before, the warriors who fought and fell, the hunters who rose and learned, the children who watched With silent strength, he passed the trees marked with human hands and Krevlon claws, and remembered how far he had come, how far he still had to going. The distance the village fire flickered like a heartbeat, calm and constant, never begging to be seen, yet always there, waiting like Earth itself, never calling out, never chasing, but always teaching. He approached slowly and sat at the edge, not to join, not to speak, just to watch, just to feel the warmth against his skin and the dirt beneath his fingers. Mara stood nearby, her hands working on a carving shaped from stone and bone, her face as unreadable as the stars above. She glanced at him and said nothing, and in that silence he found more meaning than 1,000 words. The children played near the embers, laughing and chasing shadows and pretending to hunt the wind, their joy not blind, but brave, their smiles not soft, but forged from survival and love, and stories whispered beside the fire. Above them the sky held no ships, no threats, only light and time and memory. The stars blinked with secrets older than war and kinder than victory, and Thren knew this moment would never return, and that was why it mattered more. He reached into the pouch tied to his side and pulled out the last piece of his old life, a small metal crest worn smooth by time, once a symbol of Krevlon pride, once a mark of conquest and fear, now only a memory. He looked at it for a long time, then stood and walked to the fire and dropped it into the flame. There was no sound, no scream, no sudden shift, only a soft hiss as the metal melted and vanished into the embers, joining the bones and the ash and the earth. The children paused and looked at him, not with fear, not with awe, just with quiet understanding, then returned to their games as the wind carried the smoke upward into the night sky. Mara nodded once, then spoke low and firm. "You are ready?" And he replied, "I am not, but I will." Beatty stars did not speak, the trees did not move, the fire did not burn brighter, but something inside him opened like a door without a wall, a path without a name, and he knew this was the end of one journey and the start of something he could not name. Turned from the fire and walked into the forest, his steps steady, his shoulders light behind him. The humans sang softly, their voices rising with the smoke, not to celebrate, not to mourn, just to remember, just to carry the story forward. And far beyond the skies, where no fire yet burned, the stars whispered a new tale, not of predators, not of prey, but of a world that taught even the cruelest hearts to change. The last ember faded, the night grew calm, the forest breathed slow and deep, and the wind carried the words across every root and stone. We are the hunted who learned to hunt. We are the fallen who chose to rise. We are the fire that remembers. The end.